engravings on them. So hopefully you can return and come to see those programs. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. We're welcoming our own Vice President and Trustee Roger Wilbur. Roger's talk is going to be focusing on how, over the past 350 years, the business community has evolved and changed in our community. For a number of years now, Roger's been documenting all the various businesses as we accession material and things come in. We're getting receipts and invoices, and we get yearbooks and newspapers, so he's kind of been tracking that, and he'll talk a little bit and tell you that process at the beginning of this talk. Roger's held various positions in his 40-year career with the New York State Education Department, which included supervising the New York State Research Library's preservation unit, where he created many of the preservation and conservation and structural manuals still used today. Prior to his retirement, he served as co-interim supervisor of the Conservation Library, which is becoming very useful for us because Roger does all of our conservation work and all the material we hear. So right now he's busy conserving some books and repairing the spines on them, and we're happy that he's with us because we wouldn't be able to get it done without Roger here. So he's been on the board for many years now, and in his spare time he likes to research. He's written several books, one of which is a historical account on the individuals from the town of Coeymans who fought in the Civil War. And we do have copies of that book for sale here if you're interested. And they'll be here all throughout open house and as long as we have copies of them. So with that, please join in welcoming Roger.
Thank you for coming. I also want to thank Joe for helping me arrange this presentation. He did a lot of research in making sure I had enough photographs to go with my talk. The database that he mentioned has been quite a work in progress for almost a year. It's up to 118 pages of businesses, and it covers basically from 1863 up to the present time. Most of the material I got through the yearbooks and newspapers, and of course the problem is that excuse me, if somebody did not advertise, I would not know their business. Basically, we have a list of the business name and the owner, if we know the owner, the address, Coeymans, Ravenna, Coeymans Howell, Alcove, the years. Once again, the years are not necessarily inclusive years. It's simply the years that I was able to find material on advertisements. And then of course the very last column has various information about the business, if it got transferred to another entity, or if I know the beginning and ending dates. The first business, well, obviously the first business was Baron Coeymans, because he's the one who came first, and he set up various mills. And the reason why he set it here is because of the streams and the Hudson River. He saw that it gave him power for his mills and also a way to transport his materials to other places. The Hudson River, as I said, provided farmers as well as merchants with ways to get their material out of the area and bring in material that they needed. So that the Hudson River was a main way of supporting the businesses. As you can see here, we had a lot of businesses on the Hudson River, a lot of the ice houses and businesses that were going to be used for bringing in material, especially material like coal. It was done by barges mostly, barges that were transported by tugboats, that was also known as propeller. As early as 1850, people saw the advantage of making bricks by the river because all the materials that they needed were already there. Not only that, but it was a way, once again, to be able to transport those bricks to other locations. The early brick makers, including Sylvester Harris, Liebridge, and Peter Seabridge, and Jacob Sickler, but by 1885, the more established brick makers were making and exporting bricks, such as Sutton and Sutherly, Powell and Minnick, and Roe Hook Brick Company. But by 1957, nearly all the brickyards were out of business except for Powell and Minnick, who were able to continue until 2001. By 1873, Henry Slinglin of Coeymans operated a shipping business. For many of the locally grown products, such as hay, straw, rye, buckwheat flour, apples, and other merchandise, he was able to transport the materials going out as well as bringing in materials that the community would need. Another of the very successful families in early Coeymans was the Briggs family. By 1865, A.N. Briggs had businesses in shipping, grocery, coal, stone, and insurance. J.N. Briggs followed the family tradition and even expanded on it with harvesting and selling of ice. Later, B.T., B.L., and W.S. Briggs would be involved in the local mill operations. Another big business in the town was the harvesting and storage and sale of ice. The American Ice Company was a major player in the Hudson River. They had businesses all up and down the Hudson River. Many of the ice houses for storage and transportation of ice were on the dock, and it was shipped north to Albany and south to New York City. Roe Hook Ice Company, Briggs Ice Houses, Van Hoosen Ice Company, Parker Bean, and Patterson and Elder, both in North Coeymans, and Miller Whitbeck were also ice producers. In 1879, J.M. Briggs obtained possession of the northern half of the barren island. He constructed a resort that people could visit. They would get there by boat, and they would be able to ride a Ferris wheel, a merry-go-round, climb the wooden tower, and even have their picture taken. We have several pictures of showing people getting their picture taken with Barren Island behind them. Groups, especially church and fraternal groups, especially from Albany, would come and use those for the picnic tables as well as the entertainment. By 1912, the boat excursions became fewer and fewer until eventually closed, leaving only the tower remaining. More and more businesses opened up and down Westerlo Street as well as Main Street in Coeymans. A. Van Dyke from 1882 to 1902 was a harness maker. Alex Burden did shoe repair in 1869. Admiral Southard was a grocer from 1887 to 1900. Ambrose Halstead sold tinware and plows, and then sold his business to Jacob Holmes, who with the help of his son ran a hardware store from 1883 to 1903. J.P. Snyder was a shoemaker in 1883. Finally, Alfred A. Sherman on Main Street not only owned the Coeymans Herald for a time, but was also a printer, news dealer, and ran a dry and fancy goods store. Physicians during this time included B.B. Friedenberg in 1883, F.G. Mosier in 1883, H.N. Johnson from 1883 to 92, who also ran a store, Henry V. Hull, 1873 to 1880, and W.B. Saby. Among the hotels in Coeymans was the Hotelling Hotel. Begun by Aaron Hotelling around 1865, it remained open until at least 1900. This building still stands today. One of the oldest structures in Coeymans was the Gedney House. When it was built, it remains uncertain, but workmen digging in the cellar found a scent dated 1800, and which suggested that the hotel probably dated back into the 1700s. In 1865, it was called the Union Hotel, and it was owned by William Pearsall. Captain Samuel Gedney later purchased the hotel. It was later sold to Sanford Reynolds, who in turn sold it in 1934 to Frank Frangella. Around 1938, the hotel was called the Frangella Hotel. It was across from the original Coeymans Castle. Another early hotel was called the Coeymans Landing Hotel. In 1863, W.J. Rogers was the owner. Still another Coeymans hotel in the 1880s was called the Niles Hotel. We don't know if those two hotels that I mentioned were also part of the Coeymans Landing Hotel, and just at a different time or not, or if they were separate hotels. People in early undertaking business in Coeymans included Alonzo Southard and his brothers, and possibly as early as 1858, and Robbins Brothers. The Robbins Brothers undertaking business would later be sold to the Babcock family. William B. Hull provided groceries and dry goods around 1865. The Ravine Paper Mill, located on the Hanacroy, began operation in 1832. This piece of land would later become a creamery, and then even later a restaurant. According to the 1814 Gazetteer, Coeymans had 8 grain mills, 8 sawmills, and a carding machine mill. With an outlet for their products, mills in the outlying areas were able to ship their goods to places using the barges at the Hudson River. Indian Fields was a small farming community that also contained a hotel and several stores, one of which was owned by the Briggs family. Other businesses included Casper Miller, he was a tailor, Franklin Green, who operated a store, Christian Scarborough in 1885, who was a harness maker, John Verplank, 1870, the blacksmith, and John S. Miller, who was a stonecutter. The Indian Fields Hotel was the primary hotel for the area, but there's also records of the Stiles Hotel and the Simpkins Hotel in 1895. In addition, in 1876, Hike and Norris was operating a foundry and sawmill. Norris would eventually buy out Hike, and in 1895 moved the business to Ravenna. By 1902, it became known as the Ravenna Iron Company. Stevensville, later known as Alcove, was also heavily into farming, as well as various mills and a creamery and stone. Casparas Ackerman ran a mill in Stevensville in 1770. It would later be sold to Archibald Stevens and even later to W.S. Briggs. In 1879, the Alcove Creamery was established in Alcove. The creamery would the creamery would buy the local milk from farmers and make it into butter. The museum holds some of those records. Another farming community was Coeymans Hollow. John B. Shear ran both a hotel and a store. The Shears Hotel operated from 1826 to 1870. Other people in that area during that time, in 1870, James Montrose was operating a stone quarry. Andrews and W.S. Briggs operated a grist mill selling straw wrapping paper. Electus Shear and Jefferson Powell both ran sawmills. D.B. Hollick was a wagon maker. In 1879, David Callahan had operated a store, as did J. Colvin. Daniel Bagley was operating a butcher shop, and B.L. Briggs was running a mill. John Cook built and repaired carriages, sleighs, and harnesses from 1865 to 1879. Elmer Slingerland was a surveyor. Fred Lawson ran a store between 1912 and 1917, and we have some of his records as well. By 1883, the West Shore Railroad was in operation in Coeymans Junction, soon to be called Ravenna. In 1880, Peter Pulver and his family were living in Queens, but by September 1883, Pulver purchased land adjacent to the train station and built a hotel called the Junction House. In 1884, the Junction House was so busy that he had to add an addition to the Junction House. The November 26, 1884 edition of the Coeymans Herald stated, although his accommodating capacity at Junction House has nearly doubled by the addition of more rooms, yet they are still unable to accommodate the large number of applicants. They presently have 80 boarders. One thing you have to realize at this time is that there were not a lot of houses in Coeymans Junction. So anybody coming in on the train, the only place that they could go would be the Junction House. Pulver purchased other land and built other houses on Railroad and Pulver Avenues for people who were planning on staying. In 1884, the need for housing exceeded what was available. Pulver made plans for and built another hotel, this time nearby at the corner of Main and Railroad. Within a month after its completion, he needed to add more space yet, and he added to the rear of the structure for apartments. He also added a stable and an ice house. In 1887, Pulver had another building erected just west of his hotel on Main Street. According to the local paper, this was not only going to house businesses, but apartments as well. The Oddfellows used part of this building. Peter Pulver's impact was so pronounced that at one time the officials considered naming our town Pulver. Pulver Avenue was named after him, as well as the local fire company at the time, the Pulver Steamer and Ward Hose Company. He donated the building that they would use. Pulver died in 1893. To show his impact on Ravenna, an advertisement offering 50 lots for sale from the Pulver estate. Soon after Pulver's impact on Coeymans Junction, other people began to invest in either buildings or businesses in the village. Main Street became a business district. In 1885, Stephen Vincent built a large carriage house and stable next door to the Oddfellows Hall. This area would later become the business for John Kearney at 111 Main Street. Another business that used 111 Main Street was Snyder Brothers. Opening in 1902, they sold Studebaker, Chevrolet, and Maxwell automobiles. It appears that it closed somewhere around 1948. There's another view of Main Street a little bit later. You can tell they've now paved the road. In 1886, Stephen Vincent built the Vincent House. A believer in the temperance movement, he not only purchased the Temperance House in Troy, but for a time made the Vincent House a dry hotel. It would later become known as the Park Hotel. It sat at the corner where the monuments are today. Around 1889, the Peddler Building was built on the corner of Main and Orchard. This would later house the A&P run by Roger Kilmer, as well as other businesses down through the years. Today, it is an empty lot. I don't have the picture of this, but I'll tell you anyway. Amarin Roberts came to Ravenna in 1894 and built a building at the corner of Main and Pulver. He soon enlarged it, and Babcock and Baldwin undertakers, as well as others, rented space. This business eventually became known as Bush's. An interesting story is that when Bush sold the business to the next people, one of the things that he required in the contract was that they keep the name Bush's. So a host of other businesses soon followed. The land once used as a cannery for the mushroom plant was previously used by Ward Coal and Fruit Company, American Fruit Company, and Duffy Mott in the manufacture of various apple products. As early as 1912, Arthur Van Hoosen had established a feed grain business on Railroad Avenue. With the assistance of his son Harry, it appears he was in business until at least 1956. The building is still there, and although somewhat faded, the lettering on the building can still be seen. Home delivery was in full swing, of course, with dairy, confectionaries, and bread delivered right to your door. As it became more and more desirable to ship goods via rail, river traffic became less and less used. Over time, this impacted the businesses in Coeymans Landing. Although Coeymans Junction whose name was changed to Ravenna, prospered because of the railroad, it would soon see a downturn. There were three events that helped seal the downtown area we know as Main Street. I call them three nails in the coffin. The first nail was the Selkirk yards. By 1924, the West Shore Railroad decided to build its yard not in Ravenna, but in Selkirk. Because of this, less and less traffic came through, coupled by the fact that transportation by auto was now possible. But all the men that had worked at the railroad yard now either went to Selkirk or were unemployed. The second nail was 9W. Once upon a time, what we call 9W did not proceed north from the traffic light, but at 9W, it then traveled through Main Street and connected with what we now know as 144. The opening of 9W northward, as it now exists, diverted more traffic away from Main Street. Although some businesses began prior to 9W to move to 9W, other businesses, seeing the handwriting on the wall, decided to move toward 9W. Some businesses saw the 9W corridor that held more opportunity than Main Street. Around in the early 1950s, the A&P, previously at 169 Main, moved to a new store just off 9W. Around 1960, Bud Kearney moved his auto business from 111 Main Street to 9W. The third and final nail was the thruway. In spite of 9W, some traffic still flowed through Main Street and down 144 to Albany. The opening of the thruway with entrance and exit ramps at Coxsackie and Selkirk meant that people no longer had to travel Main Street or 9W to get to Albany. Main Street was now largely dependent upon the local population for its support. The cry from newspaper and merchants alike cried, "Buy locally." People saw the larger stores in nearby communities that offered a larger selection at lower prices. Travel was much easier, and so local businesses were often neglected. Well-established businesses like the department store, previously known as the Federated Store until 1945, Foreman's and others held on, but with the advancing ages of the owners, coupled with the struggle to operate the business one by one, they closed. Those businesses that didn't close moved to 9W. Buildings on Main Street were often converted to apartments. Other buildings beyond repair were torn down. Service buildings such as barber, hairdresser, surveying, and attorney moved in or stayed. As I said, some businesses stayed and survived, such as Empire, Persico Oil, Persico Hardware, Halfway House, Trackside, and in an effort to revitalize Main Street, the River to Rail Brewery. But the question is Main Street really gone? It says, no, it's just moved to 9W. In doing this research, I came across some interesting things that I would like to share with you. Prior to 1927, there were no house numbers in Ravenna. In 1927, a petition was taken asking the officials to correct the situation. Before house numbers were added, locations were identified by either a house or just given the name of the street. Some of these included the Beck Building at 130 Main, which is no longer there. The Brick Building, which is 109 Main Street, now Rail to River. The Butler Building at Central and Main. It was what was Rayco once upon a time. The News Building, which was the News Herald Building, now the offices for attorneys, George McHugh. The Pulver Building at the corner of Railroad and Main, which is now an empty lot. The Roberts Building, Bush's, which is still at the corner of Main and Pulver. The Bailey Building, the Krenrich Building, which we have no idea where they're located. The Lerner Building, which was once upon a time Lou's Restaurant. Excuse me. The Millerick Building at Central and Main, and the Pebbler Block, which was at Main and Orchard. Excuse me. In Coeymans, We had the Herald Building, which was the home of the Coeymans Herald, the Willis Building, and the DeWitt Building, which was at Main Street in Coeymans. Needless to say, there are many others, but that's the ones I have. Another petition in 1947 was taken among for mail to be delivered to homes in Ravenna. Prior to this time, like Coeymans, people had to pick up their mail at the post office. Finally, I'd like to point out the database does not carry complete dates, as I said, but rather a time period that I could find regarding their advertising. In giving this talk, I've only scratched the surface of the information contained in the database. And the database is and can never be complete because we always have new businesses coming in. And as well, we have other resources that we come across, new directories that we find, old directories that help us add more businesses to our ever-growing list. Are there any questions? Okay, well, yes.
Do you have any pictures of the old Park Hotel, which was at the corner of Central and Main Street?
Joe, I'll leave that to you.
It's actually the same building as the Vincent House, but it was modified. So we do have pictures of it. I think we only use the Vincent House picture here, but we do have pictures of the Park Hotel.
Oh.
Thank you very much for coming.